Okay, sorry people on the Hangout. I forgot the start broadcast button. That's the important one. Anyways, so like I was saying, this week we're focusing on just sort of solidifying these CSS and HTML skills. We're going to do like a bunch of lab stuff, a bunch of in-class exercises, and as well as filling in like little holes that we kind of glazed over in the past couple of weeks. So that's really what we're going to be doing. We're going to understand correct some common CSS quirks relating to floating elements. So last time we talked about the clear property and how that relates to floats. So we're going to dive into that a bit more today and look at some other problems that arise with floating elements. Little holes that we can... That's okay. I always hate hearing my voice. It's like, we're going to use CSS to make some more complex layouts. You know, we saw that layout challenge. We're going to finish the rest of that together as like lab time. And then finally, we're gonna learn a few other things. One of which is be able to organize their CSS files. A common question that people start asking around this time is like, I've got all this CSS and it's just thrown in this file. Like, how do I make sense of it? And so we'll talk about like and strategy to start like organizing your CSS file. Okay, so that's the objectives. And click in here. And here's the rough agenda, some review. We're going to talk about some CSS features that we haven't yet talked about. We'll do a quick pseudo selector exercise. We've talked about pseudo selectors, but we haven't used them in an exercise yet. So I thought we'd do a cool little exercise there. We'll talk more about floats and other CSS quirks that you probably ran into in this last assignment, or you might have run into. I know a few people did. That's why I added it. And then finally, we'll do lab time for the rest of the class. So we'll work on that layout challenge, individually, and the TAs and myself will walk around and start looking at that stuff. Okay, so actually before this, oh man, did I not? I have some really good slide here that I pushed like a few minutes ago, and I don't see it. So anyways, I'll just talk about it because I know it off the top of my head. It's not important. It's just I thought a fun thing to talk about. Today's a leap day, right? So happy leap day. And I just thought I'd talk about how leap days are important in computing for a number of reasons. So leap days are interesting, right? Because they only happen every so many years. And nearly every time they happen, they cause major software outages. And so the last leap year, I believe, was 2012, right? And in 2012, Microsoft's Azure product, it's their cloud computing product, was down for nearly 9 hours because of a leap day bug. So they just didn't predict that when they were writing the software, they missed a prediction of the time, and it caused their software to go down for 9 hours. PS3 network also went down that day in 2012, which is interesting. More interesting, I think, is something called a leap second. Has anybody ever heard of that? Hands if you've heard of leap second. So cool. So what's happening? The Earth's rotation is slowing down a little bit every day. Okay, infinitesimal amounts, but it's slowing down a little bit. And so every few years, we have to throw in a second to our atomic clocks to sort of compensate for the slowing rotation, which is, sort of interesting. But what makes it even more interesting is like, we don't know there's no formula for leap seconds ahead of time. It's like, we kind of see the Earth is slowing down. And so we've got to add a leap second in this coming month. And so that causes all kinds of problems in software because every software system that is predicting 60 seconds in a minute is all of a sudden going to see 61 seconds some minute. And this happened also last time it happened. Well, it happened in 2015. Before that happened in 2012. And that caused Reddit to go down. It caused Foursquare to go down. It caused maybe Twitter. There's two others that I had in my slides. But so every time these things happen, these leap things happen, some system goes down. So I wouldn't be surprised if today while you were interacting with something and it was down, if that was caused by the leap day. Just an interesting tidbit, maybe not applicable here, but thought it'd be fun. All right, cool. So let's do a little bit of review. Oh, actually, first, let's sync up as we are one to do at the beginning of class. The first thing I'll have you do is open your GitHub desktop app. All right, once you have that open, if you could go to the FEWD22 repository on the left-hand side, and then in the upper right-hand corner, we're just going to sync. And you should see, some history. And it does say I added the leap day info, but I didn't see it there, so that's weird. But anyway, so now that we have that synced, I'm going to go in the left-hand side here and right-click on the repository. Remember, we can open that in Finder. And then once I'm in there, I'm just going to go into week 4, class 6, more layout. And I'm going to copy this starter code folder. And then I'm going to go back into documents, go into my named repository, make a new folder, class 6, and then just paste that item there. Okay, so I'm just pasting my starter code into class 6 folder. Anybody have trouble with that? Sweet. All right, we'll come back to that. First thing, let's do a bit of review. Okay, so we talked about a bunch of stuff last class. The first thing we kind of talked about is some more advanced CSS targeting. Okay, so we have this problem, right? We have a bunch of different elements on our page, and sometimes we want to only target one or a small set of those things rather than all the P's on the page, all the paragraphs on the page. We may only want one paragraph on the page, or a few of them. And so we talked about some more ways to do that. One, using the class attribute here. And this is sort of what this looks like in practice, right? We add a HTML attribute, class excerpt, and then we can style that by prefixing this with a period, right? So that's how we target that class, okay? And what do we know about classes? Well, first of all, let's talk about IDs, then we can contrast the two, okay? So also we have IDs. And that's also an HTML attribute, okay? Here I've got an ID of Jacob's story, and you'll notice I like my story very large, 14,000 pixel font, because I want you to be very aware of what my story is, okay? So we can target that using a £sign or the hashtag symbol, whatever you want to call it. So what's the difference between IDs and classes? If anybody remembers. Kevin?
ID you can use once.
Right. And in classes, you can use how many times? As many times as you want. Okay, cool. So in general, would we rather use an ID or a class to style an element?
Class.
Okay, Matt, why is that?
That is, once you might have multiple instances where you want to style a few things similarly. So once you use an ID, you can use it again.
Right. So what do classes encourage as far as styling goes? What do they promote using classes? Consistency? Absolutely. There's another word that I used last class that classes promote. Chris, do you remember? Okay, so specificity, right? Yeah, that's a hard word. It's not just me, right? I think I don't know if I tripped up last class, but probably I did. Anyways, so yes, if we use all classes, right, we don't have to necessarily worry about specificity in a lot of cases. That's potentially true. But there's one more thing. So we talked about consistency. We talked about, if we use classes, they all have the same level of specificity. There's one more reason, and maybe the most important reason why we use classes over other things. Yes, reusability, right? Classes promote reusability rather than having 10 tags, 10 ID tags and 10 IDs and styling each one of those. We can have one class and just put that on 10 elements, right? That's a lot less code. Okay, so classes, thinking about using classes promotes reusability in our styles, which is good. And I just said this, but remember, BP, best practice, use those classes when you can. All right, so this introduces a whole host of problems, right? Now that we have a bunch of different ways to target elements on the page, now we have this question of, if there are two rules that are targeting the same element, who wins? my opinion, I think Batman's going to win here, but that's just me. I'm a Batman guy. So what are the rules that sort of govern that? Chris mentioned one, right? Specificity. Does anybody remember some of the other rules that govern, which rule wins? Yeah. Order. And when does order matter?
When the specificity is the same.
Exactly. So if you have two rules that have equal specificity, right, then we have to fall back on the order. And is the first one going to be applied, or is the last one going to be applied in the case of order?
The last one?
Right, the last one. So we think about order both within a style sheet, okay? So order, the bottom would win over the top, but also when including style sheets in our head, okay, in our HTML. So a link tag with a style sheet at the top of our head is going to have, less order than the link tag at the bottom of our head. And we'll see what that looks like in a little bit. So again, we talked about specificity, and we talked about how you can only have one ID on a page. An ID is unique on a page, right? And classes are not. So because of that, IDs are more specific, right? So an ID would be considered more specific, and thus, in a battle between an ID and a class, the IDs win, right? And so that's what I'm demonstrating here. This paragraph has both an ID of Jacob's story and also a class of excerpt. And what font size will it have? Well, 14,000, right? Because the ID is more specific in this case. And the order, because it's more specific, the order doesn't matter. If it had the same specificity, it would. Another thing we talked about is importance. It's sort of just like a footnote on the whole discussion, because the best practice again is not to use this. If you don't have to, if you can avoid it, at all, try not to use this. But it's something you need to be aware of, because you will see it in practice. And this exclamation point important after a property says, don't listen to the rules of specificity, use me. Okay. And so in this case, even though this rule is more specific, this rule has established importance over it and is going to trump it. Okay, so in this case, the font size would still be 14 pixels, not 14,000. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Any questions so far? I'm kind of zooming through this stuff because we did it last class. So I don't want to dwell on it too much. All right, questions? No? All right, we'll keep going. Finally, in this set of things that we talked about, the last one we kind of mentioned was inheritance. And in order to understand inheritance, we thought back to that DOM tree, right? Thinking of the HTML as being a tree, and the top of the tree is, the ancestor of everybody, and then you have children that keep going down the tree, right? And children inherit properties from their parents. So in this case, we're not styling this span here, so we haven't styled this. Yet, it's still going to have a font size of 15 pixels because it's inheriting it from the paragraph, right? And so, remember I said most styles are inherited down the tree, but not all of them. Now, if I style this span directly, who's going to win in that situation? Okay, what'd you say? The span, and why is that? Right, again, it's more specific, right? Styling something directly is more specific than styling its parent and allowing that to be inherited. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions about anything? Last class, homework, anything? We'll do a more full homework review probably on Wednesday after TAs and myself have graded all of them. But if you have any questions now, that's the time to kind of ask. Yes?
Is the strong tag inline styling, like an inline styling on it, or is that something specific so you could style your strong tag as well, like in a separate CSS sheet?
So is your question, would you use inline styling to style a strong tag?
Or is a strong tag inline styling itself, so you can't style it?
No, strong tag is just an HTML tag. So it has a semantic meaning of being sort of like important, right? Because it's strong. It's sort of like emphasis, but they're two different ways to give emphasis. And the distinction between them is sort of weird, but that's just the semantics of it. The way you choose to represent strong stylistically is independent of the tag, right? So we could represent strong as being bold. We could represent strong as being 100 pixels font size, right? Or as being red font or something like that. The way we choose to represent aesthetically the strong tag is up to us, but it's separate from the markup itself. So you could style it in your style sheet.
You didn't style it with the browser default style of bold for you?
Yes, unless we style it, or if we do what?
Reset.
Yeah, or if we use a reset to sort of get rid of those default styles. So that's something else we talked about last class, was the reset and the normalized style sheets and how we use those to sort of combat differences between browsers. And we'll come back to that several times. Any other questions? All right, excellent. Let's keep moving. Okay, so this is the segment I like to call some miscellaneous CSS features that are interesting, somewhat important, not that difficult, but that we have yet to talk about together. It's a mouthful, but I thought it was a very appropriate title. In the vein of those Jon Stewart segments that have the really long names in there. I don't know. Me attempting to be funny, I'm not. Okay, so one thing, all these things you've probably encountered, whether looking in style sheets that the homeworks have provided, or inspecting elements, or in the course of this class so far, you've probably seen these things and you may not have fully understood what they meant. So this section is sort of like demystify those things you might have encountered. So one thing, and we talked about this one in an in-class exercise, but I never kind of put it in a slide, so I figured I'd do that. You can target multiple selectors by using this sort of comma-separated notation here, right? So this rule here translates to select all the P's on the page and all the divs on the page and all the elements that have the class box, okay? So this is selecting 3 different sets of elements and applying the same declaration block to those things. Does that make sense to everybody? So between, they can be any type of selector in each one, and they're all independent of each other.
What would you use?
So for instance, say you have, you want to give all of your H1s, H2s, H3s, H4s, H5s the same font, but maybe it's different from the fonts of everything else. So maybe you do H1, H2, H3, etc., and you say font family Open Sans or whatever, but you want the rest of your body to have Helvetica. So that may be a situation where you do it, or maybe you want them all to be bold, and so you do font weight bold for all those things, comma separated.
But you'd still be, most of the font size is different for each one of those head.
The font sizes, yes.
Right, so but you'd still have to do a style for the font
You would,
size.
but it would have one less line per thing. You see what I'm saying? Rather than having to write font family in each one, you can write it once like this, and then you can have smaller rules for each individual element. Does that make sense what I'm saying here? I can draw it on the board if that would be helpful. Yeah, you want me to? Okay. Sorry, people on the Hangouts, but I'm going to draw. Maybe I'll take a picture of it. So we could do this, right? We could say H1, font family, let's see the Open Sans. Can everybody see this, by the way? Yeah? Cool. And then we could, give it font size, 20 pixels or whatever it's going to be. Okay? And then we could do the same for H2. And we could give it the font family, Open Sans, and font size, a little bit smaller, maybe 18 pixels or whatever it's going to be. So we could do this, we could keep doing this all the way down to H5s, okay? Or, however far we're going to go. But instead of doing that, what we might do is just erase this one from each. That's probably not the best way to go about that. We could just take the font family portion, that's the common denominator here, and we can move that into a shared, etc., and define the font family here. My handwriting is bad, I'm sorry. Okay, and so then we have, potentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, several lines less of code. Okay. So that's one situation where you might want to do that. Okay. Here's something else you've probably encountered, and I haven't mentioned it, so and you may or may not have been confused, but in pretty much every type of code, you can have some sort of comments, and these are things that are meant for developers to read. They're not part of the code itself. So it's comments that help other developers or yourself in 6 months understand what's going on in the file. Okay, and so in CSS, comments are marked with this / asterisk, and then they end with the asterisk /. Okay, so this is sort of a multi-line comment, right? So this is not part of my CSS. It's just kind of hanging out there for me to read as a developer and understand what's happening in this file. And then you can have a single line comment as well that would look like this. Okay. So again, this is not part of my CSS. It's not evaluated by the browser. It's just the browser just ignores those lines. This is just for me as a developer and for my team, for me to sort of give them clues as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay? And what we can use these comments for is for organization, right? So one thing that I've heard several people ask me about is, I'm working on my CSS and I'm just throwing it all in there, and there seems to be very little rhyme or reason to where I'm putting it. I can tell you, there's not like one approach to organizing CSS. There are many, and a lot of them would take a long time for me to sort of explain, and they're sort of beyond the scope of what we're doing in class today. But this one is probably one of the more common ones that we see, and it makes a lot of sense in the context of today's class. So at the top of your CSS file, you may have something like this, okay? You may have just like a table of contents like you might see in a book or in a Google Doc or something, sort of warning the developer or yourself, what's coming up in the file. So you may say, first we're gonna have some utility classes, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. Next, I'm gonna have my base styles, sort of things that apply to everything on the page. Then I'll have like layout specific styles. So things like, creating my columns and all of those things that we're going to talk about today. I might have that section for that. And then I'll have like sort of content based sections. So like a header and navigation section where I style, the top part of my page. And then maybe I have the content and media. So like maybe it's like the center section these sections are really more up to interpretation. Like, generally, they're organized by like place on the page, so header, footer, etc. And then you may have like an area where you just kind of put everything else that doesn't cleanly fit into a category. And so creating sections like this sort of help you, as a person to organize them. Now there's no like cut and dry like what belongs in each section. So this is a lot of up to interpretation. But I'll give you some like guidelines on how the first few are generally used. So here in utilities, we'll have things like, we talked about the box sizing stuff, right? The set of CSS styles that give you, that change the meaning of the width property and give you some sanity when you're creating the width of the boxes. Well, we generally just plop this in at the top of every style sheet that we're working on, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. So this is going to be for stuff like this. for box sizing, for something we'll talk about later today called ClearFix that you may have encountered already, and potentially other utility classes that we might have to do common tasks that come up over and over again in our pages. Okay, so that's what that first section might be for. And then you have like your base styles. And when I say base styles, generally what that means is styles that are on individual tags, right? So styles that are shared, across the whole site. For instance, we're giving like the font information for the whole page, that would be up there. We might style our headings in this section. We may like style things like our block quote or our code tag or things of that nature. Things that are very like semantically attached to these individual tags, we might do that in like the base styles section. And then we have this like layout section, and this is where we're going to put things like our container class that we've talked about a couple times, and you'll probably encounter over and over again. We'll also put things, down the line, like grid systems might go in here, or other things of that nature. And so this is like creating those columns and rows that that we see on our page. And so that's just a section for those things. And then after that, it's like kind of anybody's guess, right? So we have this header and navigation section. Well, maybe I have, my primary navigation class, and then my primary navigation link class, and, other classes that I might find in that part of my page. And so it's just sort of like, if you can think about the page as being like a room, right? It's sort of geographically based styles, right? So top of the page styles, middle of the page styles, bottom of the page styles, or something like that. And this part is sort of up to you to decide your exact organizational structure. But if you use sort of like bite-sized little areas like this, that can be helpful. Any questions about that? Again, this is not science, right? This is more of an art of designing a CSS file. Because at the end of the day, the order and the placement probably doesn't matter if we're writing good CSS. But it's just for us to be able to go back into that file and kind of make sense of what's happening quickly. So we've talked about nested selectors, where we've so far just used tag selectors as nested selectors. So div, a span inside of a P inside of a div. Well, I just wanted to bring to your attention that you can have nested selectors of all types, right? So in this nested selector, I've got what this rule translating to is a span inside of an element with an intro ID inside of an element with a container class, right? And so we can see this is a span inside of an element with an ID of intro inside of a div with a class of container. And so this is, translating, this matches this element here. Any questions on this?
So all of that would be the golden rod yellow. All of that, just the span would be the light golden rod yellow, or
Oh yeah, you like my color? Like goldenrod yellow, real color. I put a little more effort into the colors in this class, so I hope you appreciate it. Yes, so only the word world would be like goldenrod yellow, correct. Now, would I ever do this? Yeah, probably not. This would be a silly thing for me to do. And in general, you want to use as few of these nested selectors as possible. If you can, okay? So really what I should do is just put a class on the span, right, and target that class. But this is possible, and you will see this occasionally. Yes?
But if that were the only thing on the page you wanted to make like goldenrod yellow, would it be silly to do it that way? Like instead of like if the classes were to be multiple things.
Right. If it were the only thing I wanted styled on the page, would this be the best way to do it? I see some people shake your hand. So somebody's shaking your head. Explain to me what a better way would be. If I want to target only one thing on the page. Get it?
You could put the ID on that area.
Yeah, I could put the ID on the span, right? and then I could just get rid of all this and have, target that thing directly.
So you would have like an ID intro and then an ID word, and that's fine because you have multiple IDs.
Yeah, they're different IDs.
Different.
They have to be unique, but each one, you can have as many IDs as you want as long as they're unique. Yes. I'll do it in my text editor so that people on the Hangout can see. So we've got, let me give it syntax. We've got this, right? And if we wanted to target just the span, the most sane way to do that, if it's the only one on the page and we know that for sure, and there's never going to be anything else we want with this style, the best way to do that would just be give this thing ID. And we would say like world span or something. And then in our CSS, we could just target that thing directly, and then we could give it the light golden rod yellow. Like that. So that would be the most sane way to do it. And
But then you get rid of it. Well,
potentially, maybe there's something styling that, or maybe there's a reason that's there for JavaScript purposes, and that's something we'll talk about later. So potentially we could get rid of that. But if our only goal is to target this, this is the best way rather than to use like a weird sort of nesting like this. However, there are some legitimate reasons why you might use this. We'll see one of them in a few minutes. Okay, cool. Any more questions on this? Sweet. Now, this has implications on specificity, okay? So we know a general rule about number of nested selectors, right? Does anybody remember what the general rule about number of nested selectors? There's 3 of them here, there's 3 of them here. Which one, how does number relate to specificity when it comes to the number of nested selectors? Anybody remember that?
Most selectors wins.
Exactly, right? The more nested selectors, the more specific the rule is, and therefore it wins, right? When we have all the same kind of selector, caveat, asterisk, right? So if these are all tags, and these are all tags, they have the same specificity because there's 3 of each, okay? But they're not all tags, are they? So does anybody want to guess which one of these 2 things is more specific? This is complicated. This is like a bonus super knowledge one. I guess.
Maybe the first one with the ID intro
Mm-hmm.
would be more specific.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Can you justify that?
I guess the other 2, like the classes and just the span, are equivalent. So ID would overrule the P.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's tricky, and there is an exact formula for how to calculate this, but I'll give you like sort of the general rule because that's all that really matters, right? We know that IDs are the most specific tags, right? So this one has no IDs, and this one has an ID, and so this one is going to win, almost all the time, right? And that almost is like an extreme edge case that you will never encounter, right? So as long, if this has an ID, it's going to be more specific. It doesn't actually really matter where in that chain of selectors it falls or how many of them there are. Okay, so the rule that I've seen on some sites is like you add a point for each tag selector, you add 10 points for each class selector, and you add 100 points for each ID selector. Now, I wouldn't commit that to memory because if you're running into this problem, then you have some serious retooling to do of your CSS because this is way too complicated of a selector chain in that case, right? If they're targeting the same thing. Okay, anybody have questions about it? I know that's kind of weird. So in general, we know that IDs are more specific than classes. So we see an ID here, that one's probably going to win. And that same thing is true even if there's only 2 of them, right? Even if there's only 2 and this one has 3, the ID still is going to win. Okay, can anybody spot the difference between these 2 things?
Space between header and column. The space between header and column.
Right, this one has a space between these 2 things. This one does not. And I know that's kind of hard to see at this font size. And I can't make it bigger, but so this one, you'll see, has no space, right? This one has a little space right there. Okay, so these 2 things mean different things, okay? We know what this one means, right? Can anybody translate what this means for me? And Rob, can you do it?
It's a red color hair that has class called out.
Okay, close. Can you be a little more specific in the language there? So what thing are we targeting directly?
You're targeting a hair.
Are we?
Text.
Remember, the thing that's closest to the curly brace is what is the target selector, right? The other ones are telling us how to get there. Okay, so this one translates to we're finding an element with a class of callout that is inside of an element that has an ID of header. Okay.
In this case, what the color would be? What's like
I will show you what this means. So in this case, I'm going to just use divs here, but we have an ID of header. Oops. And inside of that element, we have a class callout. Oops. Fail. Okay, so in this rule, we are targeting this element. We're targeting the element with the class of callout that is inside of an element with an ID of header. Right? Does that make sense, everybody? We cool with that? Okay. This is different. This is not saying we're targeting an element with a class of callout inside of the class, inside of an element with an ID of header. This says we are looking for an element that has a class of callout and an ID of header. Okay, so this is referring to the same element that has both of these things. So if we look back at our HTML here, which one of these things is that rule going to target? Right, we're looking for an element with a class of callout and an ID of header. Chris, you know?
The entire div.
The entire div?
Yeah, the entire div.
Anybody have another guess? The text? Anybody have another guess? It's a trick question. None of them, right? There's no element on this page that has both a class of callout and an ID of header.
So would it be up there?
I don't know. It'd be wherever we put it, right? Like, so we could put it this here, or we could put them both here. Oops, I copied the wrong thing. Right? So this is what we're looking for when we write that rule. We're looking for one element that has both of these things. Okay, and I call this like selector chaining. I don't know what other people call it, but that's what I call it. So.
When would you use
When would you use this? Say you have two things, and it's hard for me to say because generally it's not something you're going to want to do. However, if you have two things, right, that both have this class, but one of them has an ID of header, if we wanted to target this thing, we could use the chained selector, right? Because we want one that has both. This one only has one, potentially.
So that's when you use the first one, you didn't mention header job.
Right. This one refers to one element that has both things. This refers to an element that has this class inside of an element that has that ID. There's a question?
In both of those cases, if the ID and the class had two conflicting things, would the ID would always win out, right? In both cases, whether they're like on the same element or different.
So if we had are you saying if we had another rule here?
Or if like in your style sheet, your header had like font of blue and your call had a font of yellow, it would always be whatever the header was.
Correct. So, one way we could, you're right, good, that's a good point. If we really wanted to target this guy over this guy, we could just use the ID because it's more specific. I was just grasping at straws trying to come up with a practical example, and that's what I did. But
they could have like different rules that like all worked out together, right? Like nobody like shouted over the other one.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. If they're defining different properties, say, right? If one's defining font color, but the combo one is defining font, weight or something, then yes, they could all match together. So any more questions about this? And most of these things, it's like you've probably seen it or glanced over it at some point, and I'm just trying to demystify what those things actually are. So hopefully these things are enlightening. Again, that's so that's the kind of element we're targeting here. We're targeting one that has both a class and an ID in this case. Do you have some? Were you? Eric, were you? Okay. You looked like you were maybe like contemplating something. Just as a note, you can also just chain classes, right? So if we're looking for something that has both the callout class and maybe a class of, I don't know what it would be, meow, right? You could chain them that way, right? And we could keep going. We could say it has a class of also blast off or something, right? And we can keep going. So this is looking for an element that has a class of call and a class of meow and a class of blast off, right?
And in the HTML with that element, would it say like div class equals call out space space blast off, or would it be like 3 different classes?
Great question. We've talked about this once, only briefly, but how do we add multiple classes to the same element? Can anybody tell me?
Is it call out space?
Yeah,
Meow,
I think that's what you said, but I just wanted to do it one more time. But yeah, so you separate classes with a space. Oops. Right, so now this div has 3 different classes, call out, meow, and blast off. And so if we wanted to target this element with all 3, this would be one option. We could also target these things separately because maybe they're not always used together. So we could maybe have, a rule for call out, a rule for meow, and a rule for blast off separately, right? And these would have curly braces, etc. Looking good?
Because then when they're all 3, then they act a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe when maybe they have styles separately, but when they're all 3 together, all of a sudden they their powers combine, they become something huge or something. Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. Okay, this says lab. It should say code along. All right, so we're gonna go into our starter code here. And you should see a folder in there called pseudo selector. Does everybody see that? Hand if you don't, and one of the TAs can help you to find that. Okay, cool. We're all on the same page. All right, so I'm just going to take this pseudo selector folder, and I'm going to drag it into Sublime Text. And I opened on my other screen. Okay, and we notice we've got a few things in here. We've got our index file. We've got a style sheet. And we've got this README that gives us just some instructions. Yours might not look white because I've got it. Oh, you know what? Never mind. I was going to say, somebody suggested I make the background white, and I totally forgot to do that. But I will remember now for next time. So one thing we can do just to make this assignment a bit easier is we can go up to View, Layout, and go to Columns 2 to sort of create that 2-column view. And that way we can look at our CSS and our HTML at the same time, which can be kind of helpful. So I'm going to open both of those things and put one over here, one over here. Okay, I'm going to zoom this out a bit so I can just read it. All right, so what we've got here is a table with a bunch of information about planets. Okay, notice the theme of my classes. So we have a table and it's got all this information, but it's not super legible right now because it's kind of hard to see. If you're looking down this table, it's hard to see which one this thing applies to over there. And tables are sort of hard to scan sometimes. So let's just take a look at it. I'm going to open it in the browser. Okay, admittedly, it's not that bad, but it can be better. And we see this a lot of times where in a table, every other line is sort of like a little bit darker background. And that kind of helps for scanning purposes, right? So we can look and we can follow that line across the entire table. Does everybody know the effect I'm talking about? You'll notice it once we get started. But what we're trying to do basically is make every other line a little bit darker in order to make this thing a little more legible. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just use a class in order to do this. Okay. And then the next thing we'll do is use a pseudo selector, one we haven't talked about yet. So it'll be really exciting. All right, so let's take a look at this HTML. This is a set of HTML tags we haven't talked about yet. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of mention them as part of this assignment. So we're looking in this and we see, the table tag. And the table tag itself is pretty obvious what that means, but there are a bunch of tags that go inside of it that may be less obvious. So the first part of a table is generally this T head, which just means the table's head, right? And so this is where you might put, your headers that define what each column is. And so you can see these things are in our T head, right? Just the top row here. Within that, we have a tag, a TR, and that's a table row, right? And so that's defining a row of things in our table. Inside of that, we have a TH, which stands for table header, right? And so this is an individual header on that table. And so we can see the first column here is planet, the second column here is distance from the sun, and the last column is diameter, okay? So we're just defining what each column is of our table. We're going to close that row. We're going to close the header of our table, and then we're going to open the T-body. And this is where we put the actual data for our table. Okay? We walk down that, and then we just have a table row and a TD, which is basically a table cell, table data, I guess it could be. But this is where the individual cell goes. Okay? So each one of these TDs is a cell in our table. So we can see Mercury in the first column. It's 57.9. Oh, that's supposed to be 10 to the 6. Just, for accuracy. 10 to the 6 kilometers from the sun. And it's, 479 kilometers in diameter.
So if you just needed a blank cell, you would just have open tag TD, close tag TD.
Exactly. If we wanted to, if we didn't know, for instance, what the diameter of some planet in our solar system is, we could just leave a blank cell there, and that would fill, that area. Okay, so is everybody feeling okay about the table in general? Okay, so now what we want to do, remember, is we want to style our table such that every other row is slightly darker background, just so we can quickly scan it. It's easy when it's this condensed, but if you can imagine if it was all the way across the page, right, it'd be easier to scan if every other row was sort of a darker color. Okay, so the first way we're going to go about this is we're going to use a class to do that, right? Because we want to sort of select a subset of our rows in order to style them with a darker background. So it sounds like a job for a class. So let's do that. So first thing we're going to need to do is link our style sheet, because I didn't do that for us. So here in our head, we need to link to our style sheet. We're going to do a link tag. And I just hit tab and it fills all those things in for me. Some of you may have that luxury. Now we're going to use a relative path to our style sheet. In this case, we want to go into the CSS folder and find our style.css file. So we're going in, grabbing the style.css file. All right, so now we're linked to our style sheet. And now we need to add something in it, okay? So I'm just going to create a class here and call it like accent row or something. Okay. And in order to give this an accent, I'm just going to give it a background. I'll be more specific. I'm going to give it a background color of like light gray. Okay, I'm not quite done. I've now got to apply this class to the rows that I want it to be light gray. Okay, so I'll do that. I don't want to do it in the head. I just want to do it below the head. So I'll do it on the first row, the third row, the fifth row, etc. So let me add a class to the first row. Okay, so I've added a class attribute and I've given it the value accent row. Okay, so quickly, let's just see if this works. Okay, has everybody got this part? Let's find the class over here. We're applying it to the first row in our table's body. All right, let's look at that. Okay, cool. So now we can see that looks a little more easy to read, right? We can easily see what's in this first row because it's got this nice clean line across the whole table. Okay. Well, we also want to apply that to the third row. So Mercury, Venus, Earth. Okay, we've added to the third row. I'm going to go down and add it to the fifth row. And I'm going to go down and add it to seventh row. And finally, the ninth row. I've got an asterisk there. Anybody know why? Right. Yeah, Pluto's not a planet. It's a dwarf planet. So it doesn't count. But we left it in there just to be nice. Gets a lot of hate, so feels bad. Okay, so let's just see if that worked. I'm going to go back into the browser and just refresh. Cool, that's a good looking table, if I've ever seen one. But what do we notice about that process just now? Yeah, that was cumbersome, right? I don't want to be doing that. That's the one kind of thing that I really hate is that sort of monotonous, like add this class 10 times down the page. I don't like that. Okay, so let's get around that. Why don't we? We're going to use something, we talked about pseudo selectors, right? And there's pseudo classes and there's pseudo elements. So we talked about pseudo elements being things like the first letter, say, of a element, like of a paragraph. Maybe we could use that for like a drop cap sort of effect, like you might see in a newspaper. We talked about the first line pseudo element, which is like, the first line of our paragraph or whatever it may be. We also talked about pseudo classes, which the distinction there is a pseudo class has some special state, right? Whether it be like a hover from a mouse effect or something like a visited link or things of that nature. Another type of pseudo class has to do with where it falls in the tree. Okay, so there's a pseudo class called first child, which says if I'm the first child of my type in the tree, of my parent, then style me in a certain way. Okay, so if we wanted to target this guy in particular, just this first TD, we could say TD colon first child, and we would be targeting just that first TD or whatever it might be. There's equivalently last child, which would be the last thing in the tree. So let me just show you what that looks like. No need to do this because we're going to play with this plenty on our own. But say we have a div here, right? And inside that div we have three spans. I'm going to just copy this one. We have a div, and inside of that div we have three spans. I'm going to separate them a bit so we can see. First child, if we did span colon first child, that would refer only to this span because it's the first child of its parent, right? Of that type span. If we did last child, we would get this guy here, right? Because it's the last child of its parent, the div. With me so far? Cool. We can also do this. Nth child, and then give it some number and say, I want just the second child. And that would refer to this one here. Okay, so we can select any arbitrary span in this div based on its position in the tree, right? Is that making sense so far? Questions?
I'm just going back. The nth child, where do we?
So if I'm saying nth child 2, I want the second child, right? And that's this one. So nth child just means make this sort of like a variable, right?
But you're going to have to do spans for all of the children.
So that's a good point. If right here I had a strong tag, oops. This would still refer to this element because it's saying the second child of this type span. No, is that not right?
Yeah. You're thinking of nth of type.
Nth of type, yeah, okay. Right, so nth child would refer to that guy, okay. So the second child, that is a span, right? So it only match this guy. But there is nth of type, good point, sorry. Like this, oops. Nth of type That would get this guy. Thank you. Sorry about that. That's why MDN exists, right? So I don't hold all these things in my head all the time. Okay, so the reason that I've shown you all this is because there's something else we can do with this. So if we go back to nth child,
Well, what's the strong do? If that's gonna be small, that's gonna be strong.
okay, sure there's no question there? Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Take it this way. Now, say we want to do the first and the third one, but not the second and the fourth one. So what is 1 and 3? What are numbers like 1, 3, 5, 7, 9? They're odd, right? We can do this. Now all of a sudden, we're targeting only children that are odd numbered children of their parent. Okay, so this would target this one and this one, but not those two. Now, does this look like something that could be useful to us? Totally, right? Because we have.
Sounds like bullying, just targeting out children.
That was good. That was good. I wish I would have thought of that. What we notice here, though, is we got this T body, and the children of that are TRs, right? And we want to target basically every other TR, or every odd TR, say, table row. So we can do that without using this class at all. So I'm going to get rid of this class, and I'm going to remind you of a sublime trick. If I hit Command D or Control D on Windows, I can select everything on the page with each hit that looks like that, and that's going to create multiple cursors, and then I can just erase them all at the same time. So I don't need those anymore. So now what I could potentially do is I could add a class to this table body and say striped table. Something like that, maybe. And then over here in my CSS, I'm going to zoom out just a bit so we can fit all of this. Instead of targeting the accent row class, I can target TRs inside of the striped table, an element with the striped table class. But not everyone, right? Only the odd children. I'll give you a minute to sort of copy that down. Why are you laughing at me?
It's tight.
You're laughing at the odd children.
Okay, so what we're doing here, just to reiterate, we're selecting table rows inside of an element with the striped table class, but not every TR in the striped table class, only the odd children. So the first child, the third child, the fifth child, the seventh child, the ninth child, the 11th child, etc. Any questions about this? So you can see how this could be pretty powerful stuff once you get the hang of it. Because there are often times where the first thing needs to be slightly different than the next thing. Or the last thing needs to be slightly different than the rest of the siblings. You know, those last childs, they can be sort of pesky. All right, just kidding. All right, so let's just verify that this worked. I'm going to open this in a browser. And there we go. So what we did, what took us, several lines of code and monotonous stuff to sort of write those classes on each TR, we can do in one quick CSS rule, basically. Right, and we add one class rather than a bunch. Cool. Any more questions about this so far? All right, so what we're going to do now is if we look at the README, there's a third step. Instead of having every other row gray, what if we wanted the columns gray instead? Every other column. So the first column and the second column. I want you to try to do that on your own, and the TAs and myself will kind of walk around and unstuck you if you've gotten stuck. Okay? So now we're going to switch it from rows. We want every other column to be light gray. Okay? So try that on your own.
Yeah, there.
Thank you. Okay. Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Math and coding at the same time, you know, it's good. It's really,
Still grabbing the on.
Exactly. So it's grabbing this one, right? It's not the middle one, this one, because it's the filter. Yeah, that is a child. It's me. So, cool. Yeah, so remember that the THs are just the headers. Yes, so the child just means your empty child. So the TDs, this is the first child.
Yeah.
Right, so if we want to select every other TD, we can just change this.
Change the audit.
Not the odd, the change the target. Okay,
So right now it's going like this.
So you can-
so if you're styling all of the first, first column down to show one, I think you need to change it to get like
One and three. How would I tell you and would it just be like one?
You could add another selector, but in this case, you don't have to.
Yeah.
You can't do like, I mean, you couldn't write that in the same selector, you basically just comment on another selector, but think about the example we just did with every other row. So in this case, every other row is taking the TR elements. So I'm saying every other row.
So is there a way I can just like this? I can't just do first.
So change that to
The thinking here is just think of it this way. Let's say there were 5 columns. So which one can be selected?
Right.
It's sort of, like this isn't really styling like each column, it's going through each row and styling the first and third things, if that makes sense, right? It's not as though, I mean, you want to sort of like individual So it's going through each row, it's like the first and third, and that gives you like your columns are all.
In the teachers.
Because I was thinking, so it would be looking like this,
So
and then this,
Yeah,
and then this.
exactly.
So as a sequence, so it would be like 1, 2, 3,
Because.
4.
I see what you're saying. No, because if a child looks at it in terms of parental, so we start every time there's a new parental connection. So in this case, it will say that is the first child of whatever element, right? Yeah.
Okay. So it resets every time.
Exactly.
The tag gets closed.
Anytime your wrapper element closes.
I see, okay.
All right, so I'm gonna explain one quick thing, and then we'll take a break because we've gone over an hour. So I saw some people do this. Right? Did anybody do this? You guys see that? I did strike table TR, TD, nth child, odd. And this would work. However, we don't have to do that. We can simply do this. And the reason we can do that is because this part here translates to a TD that is the nth child of its direct parent, right? So no matter what that parent is, it's the nth child of that parent. So we know that this TD is the first child of its direct parent, this TR. This is the third child of its direct parent, the TR. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter anything that's here to the left necessarily in selecting which child it is. We can also do this and it would still work in this case, right? Because this is a TD on the page. This is selecting every TD on the page. That is the odd parent of its direct parent, odd child of its direct parent, right? So this one would still be selected, as would this one. Okay. The reason that we put this here is because maybe we want some tables not to be striped, right? And only some tables we want to add stripes to. And so we're kind of scoping it down to just this table or just some set of tables by using that class in front of it. Okay. So just wanted to make that point and how you think about nth child or first child or last child. It's always relative to the direct parent, not necessarily whatever precedes it in the selector group. Okay. All right, cool. Let's take a break. If you have questions about that exercise, you can ask during the break, and we'll help you out and get you figured out. All right, 5 minutes or so.
Alright, so I got everything going. With the T-headed pattern, just like get some space.
Yeah.
It just wasn't working because it should have got it here. Or does that, or was that this?
So yes, you targeted the right thing there. The issue is that padding doesn't work exactly the same way. Sort of like weird thing. But we can figure this out. You go back into
Just to stay with that.
sure.
So we need to go back in.
So go back into Chrome and first of all save that. We should save it. So, now refresh just to show that this. Now go ahead and click on this. Right click. Yeah, that's right. And then if you highlight the T-head here, you'll actually see that you do have some pattern, but it's not really affecting the content.
Okay.
And that's just because that's sort of the nature of the tables has to be very strict.
Okay. So then if I wanted padding for that, I would have to classically all the T-heads within.
You could try that, or you could get the THs and the height.
Okay.
Or something of that nature, or get them added individually.
Okay.
But yeah, so
So-
tables are a bit different than like dot elements next to each other.
Okay.
Because it's very structured, very
Okay. So basically the tables you have to be very specific.
Yeah.
So, okay.
cool.
Thank you.
So before we jump into the next section, does anybody have any other questions about what we talked about so far? Sweet. See, a couple people are still out, so I'll wait a few seconds. All right, so this first part is review, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So last class we introduced the float property, right? So this is a CSS property that we can use to sort of move things from one side to the other, but it could also be used to create layouts, and that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on this class, and we sort of started on last class. So a bit of review on floats. Remember, they were initially created sort of for this purpose, right? They're created to float, images to one side or the other so that the text could flow around them nicely, like you might see in a news article. This was the original intent for floats. And then what we learned is though this is what floats were intended for, what they really are used for, in a lot of cases, is for creating layouts like this, which has both its good things and its bad things, right? It wasn't designed to do this necessarily, and so there are some quirks that we started looking into last class that happen when we start trying to build our layouts this way. So the first thing we talked about is the need for the clear property, right? So when we have our floats, they're kind of pulled out of the normal flow of the document, and so that things can come up and be beside them. So if we have something like this, or we have two floated elements here that are different heights, and then something that's not floated below them, well, this thing could, become all of a sudden in the wrong place, and this kind of breaks our layout here. And the way we remedy that is by using, the clear class, and the clear property, excuse me. The clear property says, create that hard line and put me underneath all of the existing floats that are above me, right? So it creates that's like hitting the enter key, and having like a hard break to the next thing. And so you can do it this way. You can potentially put just like an empty element in there that has this clear property, sort of drawing that line. Or you could also just put it on the thing that you definitely want to be on the next line. So you can put a clear property on the footer in this case, and that would force it to be below all the floated things that are above it. Okay? And so now our layout looks better, right?
Clear would only work for floats. We only use them.
Clear is only used for floats, right? The clear property just means I want to clear my floats above me. I want to get beneath all of the floats that are above me. That's what the clear property means, and that's its use. Yeah. Any other questions about this? This much has been review. Okay, so notice that says float quirk number 1, which means there's going to be more. So here's a new one. It's something called the collapsing parent problem, or parent collapse, or there's other names for it that people have given. But what this boils down to is if I have some block element, and inside of that block element, all of the other elements in there are floated, then I'm going to collapse in on myself. And those things are just going to kind of hang outside of me. Okay? So and I'll show you what that looks like, in a page. But what it looks like in our HTML and CSS is like this, right? So we have a main, which is a block element, right? And inside of that, we have 3 sections, also block elements. If we float all 3 of those sections, and remember, we have to give something a width when we float it, but we were going to float all 3 of them, well, all of a sudden, this main is going to collapse in on itself. And it's not going to contain those sections anymore, okay? So here's a little illustration of what that looks like. Oh, man, the contrast isn't very good. But if you're following along on your slides, you might be able to see this. But here, in the case of the example before, this little thing here is the main. And you'll notice these things are children of that main, but they're poking out of it, right? They've come out of their container, of their parent. And that can be a problem for a lot of reasons, because, if we're creating these nice boxes and, we want to create our layout with all these things being in one section and some things below them, all of a sudden, they're not contained within that parent, and that's a problem. And you could have other things too, like, imagine you have one thing floated over here, and all of a sudden it's kind of hanging out. It can cover up other things in your document, okay? And so this would be like kind of, maybe this is covering the footer now, and we can't see the footer, and that's obviously a problem for our layout. Whew. All right, so we're going to inspect element here. For now, just follow along because we're going to get lots of hands-on practice with this in a few minutes. So just kind of watch what I'm doing up here. But we're just going to take a look at what this looks like in a browser, if that link's correct. Okay, perfect. So what we see here is exactly what we just looked at, right? We have a main here that has 3 children, these 3 sections that are floated and given 33% width. Each one's 1/3 of the width. But you'll notice that the main is not containing those 3 things. And so If we want to have a background behind them, also we have some real trouble because they're not inside of their parent anymore. Yeah.
How is the height of the sections?
Oh, well, good question. I added some CSS to explicitly do that. So let's take a look. Let's actually inspect this thing. So you'll notice, again, if I highlight the main, can you see that it's only highlighting this top little section here? So I'm hovering over the main, and I notice that, look, it's only up here. It's where we'd expect it to be this whole area because those are children of the main. And if I highlight the section, I can see it here. And then to answer your question, they have this float left, but I also gave them some other properties. I gave them a border, a background, some height, and padding, just for demonstrations purposes. But yeah, that's a great question. So we can see them there. Okay, so everybody understand what's happening here? These sections are in a main, but because all three of them are floated, the main's collapsed in on itself. And now all of a sudden it's not containing its children. And this is going to be a common problem when we're working with floats. Oops. So how do we fix this problem? Well, turns out there's a number of ways to do it. 3 that I'll talk about today. These aren't all of them, certainly the most popular, probably. The first is we can add a dummy element that's not floated within there in order to sort of force it to contain that thing, and by doing that, containing the other things. Second is we can use this overflow property and give it a value of auto or a couple of other things in order to, again, trick it into containing its floated children. And finally, we could use something called a clearfix utility class, which you probably saw in your homework if you looked closely at the top part of that CSS file. And so these are 3 different approaches to fix the same exact problem. Okay, so let's see what each of those looks like. So here's the first one, adding a dummy element or a cleared element. So we have the same markup here, but you'll notice all of a sudden we have just an empty div down here that has this class called clear. And we'll notice in our CSS, this clear class just has a property clear both, right? So remember, this is just creating this hard line underneath it, and that's kind of forcing the main to kind of come up underneath, and now all of a sudden it's containing everything. Okay, and I'll show you what that looks like in a diagram. So here's what we saw in the browser, right? This main, which is collapsed in on itself, and 2 things that kind of came out of it. Well, now we can add this dummy element, and all of a sudden the main is going to come back down and now contain everything. Okay? So this is one approach we could use. And just to show you how you do that, I'm going to show you another DevTools trick here. Oops. So in my Elements tab, I can click this main, right? If I right-click main, I can edit as HTML. And this will just let me edit my HTML right here in place. And I can experiment with different HTML without going back to my Sublime text editor. So here, I'm just going to do what I did in the slides and add this dummy element with class clear. And I'm going to just close it without putting anything inside. And if we've done everything right, we can see that caused the main to wrap around all of its children. Everybody see that? So I just added, another 4th element here that has the clear both property. And that caused the main to sort of swallow up all the floats that were above it. All right, so that's one approach. Now, I will say that's sort of the antiquated approach to that problem. That's not the one that's normally used, so fair warning. And the reason is we'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay, so to talk about the next solution, I've got to talk about this property called overflow. Okay, so this is a CSS property, and what it means is how do I treat content that comes outside of my box, right? So you can imagine you have sort of maybe a box with a height of 100 pixels, and then I write, the Bible into that box, and all of a sudden I've got a ton of content in there that's not going to fit into my 100 pixel height, okay? So this overflow property tells that container that has a 100 pixel height how to treat the rest of that content that won't fit in the box. That's what this property's intended use is, okay? So one potential value of that is hidden, which would just mean hide all the content that leaks outside of the box, okay? Which could be all right. But in the case of, we've written a novel in 100 pixels, that's probably not what we want to do. We probably want to do something like scroll. And that will add a scroll bar to whatever container we have, and we can just scroll down and see the content. So sometimes we see the scroll bar on the side, very side of the browser, but sometimes there's scroll bars, within the content itself, and that's using this overflow scroll property. Another value is overflow auto, which just kind of picks again, just to get some practice, if we want to know what all those things are, we can type in, something like CSS overflow. And, I usually choose the one on MDN. And it'll tell us exactly what all those things. And so auto is sort of confusing, but it depends on the browser. So Firefox by default gives you scroll bars, whereas I think Chrome by default gives you like hidden, right? So there's sort of like different treatments. But in general, we use overflow auto for this particular problem. So the overflow property has other uses than just this problem. Whereas like the clear property, its only use is for clearing floats, right? So I just wanted to create that distinction that the overflow property has other uses as well. So we can use this overflow auto CSS property on the parent to trick it into containing its floats. And there's no real like obvious reason why that happens. It just does, and it's like sort of a thing that you have to know. So this is what that looks like. Here we are again with the main collapsed in on itself and these things floating outside of it, right? And all we do is we add, oh man, this is not the greatest font color, but we just add this overflow auto property to the main, and all of a sudden it's going to contain its floats. So you want to tell me, why this might be the other approach that we talked about, the dummy element, might be inferior to this approach? Yeah?
Because that one requires added HTML.
Exactly. Right. So the first approach requires us to add HTML that has no semantic meaning, right? Its only purpose is for, tricking the container into containing its floats. And, if at all possible, we want to avoid adding HTML only for the purpose of styling. And so this approach, besides being less characters to type, right, is also sort of the preferred approach for that reason. So once again, let's take a look at how we do that. So here we go, back to the problem. Collapsed parent, 3 children floating outside of it. So for this one, I just take my main. You notice I've already given a background red and padding of 10 pixels. So if I just give it overflow auto, now it's containing its children. All right. Okay. Now we'll talk about the final approach called clear fix. This is sort of like the most preferred in some situations. And I'll talk about why you might want to use this one over overflow auto. But first, let's talk about what it is, okay? So this is just a utility class, just like we might put up at the top with a border, box sizing border box, right? We may just put this at the top of our CSS file so that we have this class to use. Now, what is this part of it? Anybody know, what do we call these types of things? With a colon and then a word. We did a little exercise on these moments ago. Yeah.
Pseudo-class, yeah.
Yeah, it's a pseudo class, pseudo element. Shoot, I don't know which it was after considered. Is that a pseudo element?
No.
Yeah, pseudo element. So it should technically have two of these things there. Fun fact, the browser will be perfectly happy to make this work if you forget how many colons to put there. So it's a pseudo element. And what the after element does is basically create that dummy element in the DOM, right? So when we put a div there at the bottom and gave it that clear property, the pseudo element after does that without us actually adding an element at all. So it puts a fake element in the DOM at the end of anything marked clearfix, and then it gives it these properties. Now, the exact mechanics of this, we're not going to really worry about. But this is because there's actually many different implementations of clearfix, and this is like maybe the most popular now. This one's only compatible back to IE8 though. So if you need to support browsers that are earlier than that, it's going to get more complicated. But this is just, if you Google like clearfix, you can find like 10 different implementations of something like this. So how do we go about using this? Starting with our collapsed parent. Our main has collapsed and it's got these floated children. We just add this, man, I really should have that font color, so my apologies. We add this class clearfix to the main, and that's how, that again adds that pseudo element here underneath of the after, and then gives it those styles, and now all of a sudden it's containing its children. So sometimes we call this like a self-clearing element when we use that clearfix, because it's clearing itself without adding any new markup. All right, so let's finally take a peek at how we use that. So we're starting here, same thing. We just assume that we've got a style sheet where we've defined our utility classes in it, because I did. And then another thing we can do with our dev tools is I can right-click this main. And last time I hit edit HTML to sort of edit the whole HTML. If I just wanted to add a class, I can use this add attribute. And it'll drop me in a cursor, and I can say class equals clearfix. And hit enter. And voila, we're cleared and fixed. Okay, cool. Any questions about that? All right. So again, I talked about adding the dummy element is not always the best thing to do. Now, can anybody tell me why you might use this one instead of overflow auto in some circumstances?
Because overflow is inconsistent between browsers.
Potentially, overflow auto might be inconsistent between browsers. That's true, potentially. So, but there's another reason as well. So remember, the clear property's only job is to clear floats, right? The overflow property has another job, and occasionally we might want to use it for something else. Okay. So in the case, if we're using clearfix, it's very clear, that we're using it for that purpose of clearing floats, right? This overflow auto, we have that overflow property that we might want to use for other things, okay? Because it has other uses. So, in 99% of situations, this will probably be sufficient. But, this is, probably 100% of the time, something like that. Okay. Let's see what time we got, 8:13. I'm gonna skip the bonus stuff. Actually, I'll breeze through it really quickly. I'm not gonna get into the explanation. I'll get into the explanation of how you'd use this a little bit more next class, but I know a lot of people encountered this on the homework, so I just wanna briefly make you aware of what's going on, okay? So bear with me here. So there's another CSS quirk called the collapsing margin problem, or margin collapsing. And what this generally means is that if a child is inside of its parent and if their borders are touching, right, the child and the parent's margins can be collapsed into one margin. And all of a sudden that child's margin is leaking out of the parent. Okay. Now, I know that probably by itself is very confusing, so let me show you some pictures. Here we go. We've got a header and an article. This is like maybe a layout that you saw in your homework, right? Where we had like a top part and then another part, and they had different backgrounds potentially. Notice we haven't set any margin on here, so we've got margin 0 on the header on the article itself. Now we put an H2 inside of that article and give it margin 10, and something unexpected happens, right? There's a little bit of space created between those things. And a lot of people I saw encountered this on their homework. And the reason that space happened is because the margin of this H2 was collapsed into the margin of the article, and it was leaked out of its parent. Okay? So this H2's margin is now leaking out of that parent, and it's pushing it away from the header. Okay? So how do you think we might fix that? Well, our handy-dandy friend overflow auto will force that margin to not collapse into the parent's margin, and all of a sudden this guy is going to be pushed down from the parent element and not leak out at the top. Okay, so I just want to make you aware of that. I'll probably discuss that again on Wednesday, but I know a lot of people encountered that on the homework, so before you kind of think you're going crazy, know that this is sort of a weird thing about CSS.
And the overflow pattern is really what most people use for most of these fixes.
Well, I can't think of anything it fixes outside of these two situations.
Yeah, that's what I'm just saying. And all the,
Which one's more common, overflow auto or clear fix?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I can answer that. I think I've seen them almost equally in use. I mean, because overflow auto is a single property, right? It's really easy to write. It fixes two different problems that you might have. Whereas clear fix is single use, right? It's a very focused solution to one problem, and it's not going to affect anything else. So they both kind of have their merits, and in practice you see them both. So okay, all right. So we're gonna jump to the lab portion now for basically the rest of the class. Okay. We started on the layout challenge last class, and we sort of did that one layout with the 2 columns. And let's just reflect on that. So if you go into your named repository and actually go to last class, class 5, that's where the layout challenge was. Was anybody not here last class and doesn't have the layout challenge? Okay. Sweet. So we'll go into class 5, into the starter code, and there's the layout challenge there. And so really quickly, I'm just going to open this up, and we can take a look at these. So last class, we did this one, right? Sort of 2-column layout. And we handled that one without too much issue. We've got this 3-column layout we're going to try, and we'll do this one together. And then we're just going to let loose, and we're going to do these more advanced layouts, right? So here's maybe a simple marketing layout. Here's marketing with like a navigation area, right? This seems like pretty familiar. And then here's like something really crazy, like you might see on like a newspaper's website or something like that. Okay, so here let's just take a look at a few websites and start looking at what these things look like. So I like SpaceX, so I'm gonna go to their site. So when we're creating layouts, right, what we really want to do is start drawing boxes around things, right? So we clearly got one big box here. And then if we scroll down, you know, maybe there's a box here, right? And then within that box, there's 3 columns, basically, 3 little floated elements, potentially. Down here in the footer, we have, you know, another box. And then here we have, you know, 4 little boxes, like probably floated. Okay, so everybody see that? So you gotta start kind of thinking of these things as like a grid, right? And we have to draw boxes around things in our head in order to know how to create that HTML in a way that will fit our desired layout. So let's look at one more that's a little more intense, the Washington Post. Now here we've got some like really crazy stuff, right? We've got, you know, first of all this, you know, which maybe each of these is a thing there, right? And we've got a giant ad that's getting in the way. And then here we've got basically 3 columns, right? See that? 1 column here, 1 column here, 1 column there on the right. If we scroll down a bit more, then we get some more interesting stuff. Well, this one is like kind of in these 2 columns wide, but then there's 2 columns within that. Cool, so we can start drawing boxes. Like you can clearly see this is sort of a box here. And within that, maybe there's a box here, or you know, something of that nature. Or maybe it's like this. You can see it kind of continuously changes layouts as you scroll down, which I always find a little interesting. There you go. Okay, so just wanted to give you some like real examples of some different layouts. So let's start on this layout challenge. So I'm gonna just drag this layout challenge to Sublime Text. And it's going to open over here. Oh, and let me do view, layout, 2 columns. Did it on the wrong one. Okay, so we had some stuff that we put in there last time, and I'm just going to actually get rid of most of that stuff, and so we can kind of start from scratch on our 3-column layout. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take one more look at what we're trying to create here. So we're going to do this one this time, right? Got this probably header here, some sort of left sidebar, probably our main content. On the right, some sort of other right sidebar maybe, and then finally a footer, okay? So those are kind of the components. And the way we're going to attack this is we're going to write our HTML first, and then we're going to start to style it in such a way that gives us that layout. All right. So we know that there's going to be a header here up top. And I'm going to actually put some real content in this so we can see, you know, what's going on. All right, so there's our header. Then H1 inside telling us the title of the page. So the next thing we've got is basically our 3 columns. But what can we say about those, right? We can kind of draw a box around these 3 columns. Okay, and this could be helpful for us in layout. We can have this one box around here, and then we have these 3 things floated inside of that box, like we did in the previous examples. Okay. So let's take that strategy. That's not the right one. So let's say this is our main content here. And within that main, maybe on the left-hand side, it's a nav. And that's just like another navigational area on our site. And I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit content in here, maybe like an H4 and say navigation. And then maybe that second column is like our article. And here I'm going to put the title of the article, which is, I don't know, happy days. And then there's like a paragraph in here. Remember, we can use that forum ipsum text. Ipsum or da da da. I don't know if that's right, but it's close enough. Okay, and then finally, maybe our right-hand sidebar is like an aside. And then there, we have like a title for like our advertisement. So this is for like bacon flavored chestnuts. Like a weird new Trader Joe's product that you really have to try. And then finally below that, we've got a footer. And just inside there, we're going to do like some copyright text, where we can do ampersand copy colon, a semicolon, and that will give us that copyright symbol. I'm going to say Jacob, 2016. Okay, cool. So now we've got the markup that will kind of give us that site. But if we look at it in a browser, I'll let you catch up for a second. When we look at this in a browser, what's it going to look like? Any ideas? Well, it's not going to look like much. Looks like I've got some CSS still. Yeah, I didn't save this. That'll do it. Cool, so not really what we're going for yet. Any questions about how I arrived at this markup with this HTML? Makes sense, right? Yeah, question.
Is this the 3 columns?
Yes.
So the first one all the way to the left would be the main, and then the nav, and then the article to the, or the aside to the right.
So the main is a box around the 3 columns, right? The first column is the nav on the left. The middle, the big column, is the article, and the aside is the column to the right, okay? And so we drew that box around those 3 columns just to sort of make our lives a little easier when it comes to creating that layout. Okay. So let's go ahead and start styling these things. So I'm going to use some of the techniques that we talked about in class for CSS organization. And I'm going to actually create a little table of contents up here for our CSS. So the way I'm going to do that is if you actually do a / ****, and then hit enter, Sublime will be helpful and it'll kind of make this multi-line comment for you. Everybody get that to work? Okay, maybe that's a plugin I have installed. In any case, you need this / and then another / to end the comments. It could be I have a newer version of Sublime than you. All right, so we're just going to kind of create the outline for our style sheet. Similar vein that we did in the slides earlier. All right, right now, that's all we need because we don't have much going on so far. Okay, so now we've kind of created the table of contents. I'm just going to label each section as we go. So here, and normally we wouldn't type these out. I'm going to just because, it can help me kind of talk about them a bit. But normally we just go to either a file we've worked on in the past or, some internet Google search and just kind of get these things from some other thing. So we're not like having to remember how these utility classes work every time we use them. But the first one we want is sort of our box sizing fixing. So we're going to do box sizing border box on the HTML. And we're going to do this cool little trick here. Oops. To make sure that that applies to everything on the page. And as I'm typing these things, I'm going to put them in Slack, so in case you get behind, you can sort of copy them. So remember, this changes the way that width works on our page. So this will make us sane, especially when we start doing our layouts, because it makes the width mean the entire box, including padding and border, and not just the content. Okay, the next thing we might add is our clear class. If in case we wanted to use this, I don't know that we will, but just a class that tells an element to clear both. And then finally, we are going to add our little clear fix CSS. That's going to clear both. Oops. And to have content that, and it's going to have display. I'll just put those in Slack as well. All right, cool. So we've set up some utilities that we can use throughout our page. That's good. So let's keep it going. So the next section we're going to do is sort of our base styles. And I'm just going to add some things here to sort of help us see those boxes on our page. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to add a border to a bunch of stuff. So say the header, comma, the main, comma, the nav, comma, article, side, footer. Cool. So again, does everybody remember this comma separated notation? We talked about this in the beginning of the class. This means find all the headers on the page, and all the mains on the page, and all the navs on the page, and all the articles on the page, and all the sides of the page, and all the footers, right? And apply some styles to them, right? So each of these are independent of each other, and it's just selecting all of those things individually to apply styles to them. So I am going to do that now. I'm going to apply a border of one, or actually let's make it a little thicker. Let's do like 3 pixels. Solid border, and I'll do just black so we can see it easily. I'm also going to go ahead and give these guys some padding, 10 pixels of padding. I'll give them like a background color of, we'll do light gray. Oops. So just in case you're getting behind, I'll paste this in. So. Okay, so now if we go back to the browser and refresh this, we can see, it's starting to take shape a little bit, right? So we can see where each of these things are, and we can see we have these three things here, but they're block elements and they're filling their entire width. So that's not quite what we want yet. All right. Everybody understand what's going on so far? Perfect. Okay, so let's take this thing and make it the layout that we want. And include it. Oops, this should be 2. Put it in our sort of layout section of our style sheet. Okay, so we've got a nav here, an article here, and a side here. Let's start with the nav. What do we want to do to this thing? So first thing we need to do is kind of change it from that like block nature where it wants to take up its entire width. We need to change it so that it will happily sit alongside of other things. And how do we do that? Yeah, we're going to float it, right? We're going to use that float property to kind of float it off to one side. And, like we often do when we're creating layouts, we're just going to float it to the left. Okay? Now, when we start floating things, what do we absolutely need to include in that rule? Yeah, I heard somebody say it. We have to include a width. When we're going to float something, we've got to tell it how big to be. Because if we don't, it's going to be very unpredictable and different in different browsers. So what kind of width do you think we want to give this thing? Let's take a look at the mock here. The nav, remember, is this element here. What width do you think we should give that? Just like a guess, nothing specific. 15%? Okay, yeah. Why not say 15 pixels?
Because that would be absolute, whereas 50% is relative.
Yeah, exactly. So 15% is pixels, remember, is an absolute measurement. And we don't necessarily know how wide this is at any point in time. So we don't want to do it an absolute measurement. We'd rather use a percentage, like sort of a relative measurement to the whole. Okay, so that is great. So let's do width 15%. All right, we're going to do something similar for the other two columns, right? The article and the aside. So let's go ahead and do that. We're also going to float this left. And, this guy's the big one in the middle. So, let's say we give it 70% of the width. And then finally, we'll do the footer. We're also going to float him left. Oh, yeah, thank you. Wow. So, right, the third column, which is the aside. First column, second column, third column. I'm going to float that left and give it also a width of, what do you think? Anybody have a guess as what this width should be? Well, so far we've got 15% and 70%.
Should be 10, so you can answer that.
Should be 10 because of what?
So you can agree for the borders.
That's a good point. It would need to be 10 or something less than 15, right, which would equal 100%, if we didn't do this. Yes. If we didn't do this, we'd have to account for those borders. But we did that, and now math works, so we're happy. So instead of doing 10 or something less than 15, we can do 15. We can go full 100%, right, of that width. So 15 plus 70 plus 15. Now we've got 100% width. Okay, so now if we save this, should be able to go in here and refresh. Okay, we've got 3 columns, but now we've got an issue. Does anybody see what that issue is? Which one? Okay, so the footer's doing something weird. If you look really closely, you'll notice the footer is behind these 3 columns. So the footer is behind these. And you can see it starts here, it's right here, and so it's behind them. So what's happening that's causing that? I think I heard, Matt, you said it. Exactly, the parent of these columns collapsed in on itself because all 3 of its children were floated. Okay, so the parent of these 3 things, remember, is the main, and it's collapsed in on itself. So if I inspect this element, I can see this main here. When I highlight it, it's just this much. It's not containing its children entirely. So we know how to fix that now, right? There's several ways we can fix that. We can add that dummy element at the bottom of the main in order to sort of force it to contain its children. We could add the overflow auto property on the main and trick it into containing its children, or we can just give it a class of clear fix and tell it to, have that after thing with the clear at the bottom. Okay, so that's probably going to be the easiest. So let's just do that. So here's our main, right? Here's a nav, an article, and a side. Well, if we look at our CSS, all 3 of those things are floated, and so that's why the main collapsed in on itself. And so in order to fix that, we can just add our clear fix property. And since we've defined this up here in our utilities, that is going to basically put a fake element here. Now, this isn't what, don't write this. This is what it's doing. I'm just kind of demonstrating. It's basically putting this like fake element here that doesn't actually exist, but it, for the purposes of styling, it does. And it's giving this thing a clear both property, and that causes the main to clear itself. Yes.
Can you explain why it did?
So why did it collapse in on itself? There's really no great explanation, but what the rule is, if I'm a parent and all of my children are floating, I'm going to collapse. So that's why it did it, because that's the rule. Basically, when you float something, it kind of takes it out of the normal flow of the document, and for that reason, the main has trouble figuring out where it's supposed to be. Okay, and so when we add that clear fix, it's kind of forcing it to really think about its life and contain its children and be a good parent. Okay, so now that we've added, all we've done is just add that clear fix class to the main. We can come back over here, refresh, and we'll notice now the main is containing all 3 columns and our footer is back in its sort of rightful place. Everybody see that? Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the affirmation. I noticed you nodded. I was just happy you got that.
Yeah. Always.
Cool. All right. So one more thing I'm going to point out before we kind of turn you loose on the rest of the layouts. One thing we've done a couple times so far is sort of squeeze and center this content in order to make it not so wide that it kind of looks a little weird. And this is a common thing we see. We saw it on the Washington Post, for instance. I'll just go back there. You notice, when we're looking at this, the content is not going all the way out to the very edges of the browser, right? It's kind of squeezed in and centered here, so that it's all very digestible and there's plenty of space and it just kind of looks nice. So that's a very common thing that we're going to want to do. And we've talked about this once or twice, but I'll show you how we might do this again. So down here in our layout, we might create a class called like container. Okay, and now remember, how do we center a block element? This is something we've kind of brought up a few times. How do you go about centering a block element? Right, so you kind of restrict its width to something that you are happy with, maybe 1,000 pixels, 900 pixels, maybe a little bit bigger. And then you use margin auto to sort of allocate the margin to either side of the element. So when you restrict the width, because it's a block element, it's going to fill that with margin. And then when you give it margin auto, it's going to like take half of it and put it on the other side. So now it's centered. Okay. So let's just say, we could say this with, let's say 900 pixels, margin auto. We could say this. And, for the heck of it, let's see what that would look like. So let's put all of our content inside of a container. Now, why am I using a div here? I often caution against using divs, so why am I doing it here? And I'm going to put the open tag there, and I'm going to put the close one after everything else, before the body ends, right? I'm wrapping everything basically in this container. Anybody want to guess why I'm using a div?
Strictly for stylistic purposes.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with the content on the page. It's only for styling these things and kind of squeezing it and centering it. Like that's its only purpose. And so in this case, a div is sort of the appropriate tag. Okay, so this will work, and let's go ahead and see what this would look like. All right, cool. We're squeezed and centered. We like that. You notice that all these things have kind of compensated for that size shift. We love that. Now, I'll show you something interesting, though. We shrink down the browser, keep shrinking, and once we get smaller in that content, it's going off page, right? We don't really love that, okay? So we can make a small tweak here to kind of combat that and make it a little bit better. We could do percentage, but then it's changing every time I change the browser size, which is not exactly what I want, right? Any other guesses as to how we might do it? It's a very small change from what we have here. It's not a property we've necessarily talked about in class, but it's one you might have encountered. I'll say it's something in lieu of using width.
Does it include the word width?
It even includes the word width. Almost. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it, but the opposite of that, right? We want to define like a maximum width that this thing can be. And once the browser gets below that maximum width, we're happy to let that thing shrink down. So rather than define the exact width, we're saying don't be any bigger than 900 pixels. So when the browser gets really big, it's going to stay kind of squeezed and centered. But when the browser gets small, it's going to squeeze down and be small with it. So this is like, we're going to talk, we have a whole week on responsive CSS a little bit later in the course, but this is sort of like the first taste of like, responsive CSS, right? So I'll show this one more time. So remember when I do this and the browser gets below 900 pixels wide, it's a little laggy, but once it gets below 900 pixels wide, you can see up in the right-hand corner, it actually says when I move this, the width, it's saying it's around 788 pixels here. The content is going off page, which is not great because now we have to scroll horizontally. So instead of width, we might define a max width and save that. And now my computer is really struggling. And now when we refresh, okay, well, it looks the same at this width, still 900 pixels. But when my browser gets below 900 pixels, we'll see that this starts shrinking down with it. And now this looks a little more responsive. There's no more horizontal scroll, right? So again, just a taste of what's to come. There's a whole bunch of stuff we'll talk about when we talk about responsive design to make your site look good at different screen widths. But this is sort of just like a taste of that. Okay, cool. All right, so now that we've got all this, let's first of all take a little break. We've been at this for another hour. And then when you come back, we're going to just, for basically the rest of the class, just work on the rest of those layouts individually, and the TAs and myself will kind of circulate and help you out when you get stuck, okay? And so this is really, to challenge you to sort of build those more complex layouts on your own using all the tools that you already have. Yeah. What's that? Well, remember, this box here is the main. And this one is well within that main, right? So it's not leaking out of its parent. The parent has a collapse.
How would you make those uniform? I guess more uniform.
Oh, in height?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. In a real web page, we wouldn't necessarily need them to be uniform in height. We wouldn't have borders on them showing people that they aren't uniform in height, right? So if you think about this, if you can just kind of imagine with me, removing those borders on those 3 columns, and now it doesn't look that weird, right? And we can kind of see what that looks like. All I have to do is sort of uncheck the border. And we can kind of see, like, you can't really tell that they're different heights. Like, this kind of looks like a real layout.
Right.
Question?
I have a question about layout.
Sure.
Can you figure out
Yes.
So, I'll tell you what it looks like. We go back to the browser. How floats work. So, if the width of the exceeds 100%, it's basically the last one is going to go to the everything. So that's one of the big floats. A lot of users represent think that you have 3 content representing individual columns inside the group. So, saying TR and channel, this is telling you that the collective row of those 3 columns is exceeding.
What we want to do is we want to strip every
Well, so things that do add up to 1%. But maybe,
Now, the reason
not
it's
counting
still
with
not is because your TDs
yeah.
are a
And
channel.
I can already see that it's here, and it's just
body,
like
the table,
little
body,
tiny.
the body type CSS is this table, this
So if we
table.
look at the
So if you were to take this class
that looks good.
and move it to like the T body, for example,
Yeah, it's 40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's missing one character.
Oh, that's semicolon.
Yes.
Okay. Oh man, it's something that small.
Yeah.
Got it.
There we go.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I had the.
Cool.
Now
Yeah.
we're placing
Yeah.
points in.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the the skills that you develop over time is to second guess every character, right?
Yeah.
So to keep making something very small like that, it's very rare that you just have
Always
fuzzy
want to make sure that
misunderstanding.
you're trying to target is a child.
It's much more common that you just miss the symbols.
So when you type it all the way up here.
So I feel like this is
never
like
gonna target any
like
kids
example
because
question,
they don't
but
know a
why
child
would
of
this
this
sound
row
right?
in the class.
To like explode.
I mean, it's not a jump
Because that was the problem where
Consider
I rolled
this-
before.
yeah,
Right.
Well, first of all, if this is centered and it's not floated,
You know,
what
so
do
if
you do
you change this to say TR, now it's gonna string
so it's gonna take up its whole width.
So that whenever you see a space, that always not space like that.
So that's not gonna consider something that works. So why do we slow that straight? But the answer is we could. It would still look cool because they all have 2% on the right side. And the left side. However, for that reason, like I said about like going to the next line and maybe in response to the second one, then
Through,
three
okay.
columns to two, they often flip everything up, so that works.
Yeah. Just you like
And also you don't have to.
Yeah, I just got that from.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, I don't know if you read through it all day. If you had any questions, but I did not.
Okay.
Take your time.
Not
Just
necessarily.
let me know if you have any questions.
That's great, thank you.
Text that is not necessarily but that is a good question. Probably not
Okay, thank you.
Cool, yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean,
Within the name, so you're
actually, no. Yeah, I'm not sure actually.
and then it's
Yeah, I
article
use,
or
yeah, I just put article, section. I mean, that's just how I did it last year.
Oh,
But I'm still working
All right, does anybody have any questions about what we're supposed to be doing now? We're gonna go down through that PDF and try to create the rest of those layout challenge layouts. And you can just you can work here, you can make a new HTML file if you want, but probably easier to just modify this one and try to make it within there.
So, with this one, you still guess this and then
Yeah, so exactly. Like, I would draw a box around these here, right? And you might draw another box around those two.
and this would be,
Like maybe a section or something.
And then
Each
like
place would be
article.
an article. Exactly.
and then this would be like a, so that
Could be divs, I mean, if you, the challenging thing right now, let me actually say this to the whole class. The challenging thing about like knowing exactly which tag to use for these layouts is like, there's no content in there, right? We don't actually know what they're representing. So don't worry too much about your tag choice. If you use a section or an article or a side, right? Like that's not really the important part of the assignment. So don't frustrate yourself thinking about that because there's no content here. We can't semantically know what they mean, except for like maybe the header is pretty obvious, the footer is always pretty obvious. Beyond that, don't worry about the exact tags too much. Okay. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah.
Raise your hand if it's,
Oh my God.
No. You all right?
It didn't get on anything, but I did just spill all of my precious water. What was your question?
I can.
Okay. This will be just like 5 seconds.
Basically just cheat those and throw up some in with. You can if you want, yeah, basically the whole point is just to get comfortable with this. If she's separate, like I was gonna see, a lot of other.
Well, but padding will down, so you've got both padding is necessary, so what you did was you just added 22 points to it. So you now added those, padding inside as well as here, but it does not create space in between. So. So what I would actually do is take it a little bit, and by that I mean just yes, well, yes.
You say a little overflow out
So.
of
Thanks. That was good.
You don't want to do that, you want to.
Right, exactly. You want to have classes to target the divs you control.
Yeah, I mean.
Nice. Okay.
You guys, so yes, that is one way you could do it.
Everything is still smooth.
Exactly, that's the trick, so there's few ways you can solve it. There's actually a CSS that isn't like super long.
Did you, okay, let me see the other.
And it will be.
So just a simple marketing, looks like you're going to a class.
Yeah, exactly, you actually like map calculations in there, and just figure it out for you.
Go back to
It's
the
not
doc.
like super supported, so I wouldn't rely on it too heavily.
Sorry, so look at the end of this thing.
It is basically.
In the end of your URL, okay, it's going like that. Okay. Got the link, we're linking to our, check out this. So where is our simple marketing HTML file?
Okay. Is there any way to just move that?
Sadly, not within Sublime, so you can.
So I can go into Finder and then pull it out? Okay.
And or you could just like, for now, just like change this relative to app. Exactly.
Okay.
Since it's in the folder.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So now what you do is.
Columns there.
Oh, it's beautiful. Done it. On to the next one.
Cool. Is it a badge? So I just like made a bunch of sections. Is it badge and like have them all be the same type of tab?
No, I mean, and actually section is often used in combination with other sections, right? Because if you think of like, there's section 1, section 2, section 3. That's a perfect semantic use for that.
Okay, even like within another section.
It could be a subsection, right? So semantically it makes sense. Again, like don't stress about that too much because there's no content here for us to know what those things are supposed to do. But you know, that's perfectly
Awesome.
questions. That's a great question. No, you're only supposed to have one unit per page, just like an H1, right? Because there's semantic elements. I mean, there's only one main thing.
Oh, yeah.
Potentially, so the main, remember, the main is just, kind of highlighting which part of your page is the most important. So, you know, if you think this part is the most important, maybe that's the most. Potentially good, there's nothing wrong with that. However, I will say, something else to say, I'm drawing the box.
So the reason that
I'm drawing
works.
another box here, because this one's
This is one of those use cases where you have to do something like this way.
So it has to have a separate parent in order for us
So,
to control the spots.
All three of these are salaries are the same. They're all the same.
First of all, why?
Size. So they don't have any more.
Well, I can't tell you about
Containers,
Right.
size. The things inside of them on these.
Yeah,
guys.
so I do probably just those different headers have the same amounts of margin below it. Okay. So yes.
So.
And then also, how do you?
It's this guy.
Doing margin
has and your.
Because now we're not, it's acting like block and
Right, so those are the ones that are actually visible.
Right.
Right.
So, for now, you just want to make sure
I
that
mean, this is all.
3 columns adds up to
You're not getting.
Yeah.
Right, so,
Exactly.
sure, this one now.
He's
got some.
Yeah,
No,
it's doing passion.
He's got a margin on it.
Yeah, you can
But
say-
all he's doing is.
So that's like the main because there's on the side.
But I'm on the control side. So I'm just taking containers outside and using whatever my container will allow. So my container is only allotted however many pixels that ends up being.
it's actually making
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like the first house in this case, just that's how you can move forward.
So it's fine that it did. I saw it.
Yeah.
Well, it's fine.
Well, what do you now?
Yeah, that's so weird. Well, what is that?
Yeah, I was saying it's like nice.
Oh, it's not one of those weird bits.
Yeah, it's really,
Like to do the overflow.
Or do you go to auto, you can also just add it.
So you get some, you could probably even them out like.
So,
Yeah, you can so the margin is all 5 pixels in margin that way. Here.
Right, you have, you also have,
So some ways you can.
Something.
There's actually a far better section again than all of these things. It's called flex box. So. Okay. It always okay, so now it's there.
Sure. Yeah, especially for this exercise, I think that's helpful, just to like,
Yeah, that's kind of like.
you can keep the time in there too, like, just make sure you get that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it lets you say.
Yeah, side by side.
What do you
So-
apply
And
to
it's just
this?
like things at the same time, just
This,
like, oh, height for.
Like,
so right now, this kind of works.
like, are you always doing
So, yeah.
This is-
I'm often,
Yes.
And real life, I'm talking about this, probably just something like.
a lot of
It's
people.
No, just like, just so that, you would have like,
And then basically,
you have a lot of things that says,
just like that some size and just store it right. And then within there, you can actually sort of.
We could just wait right now and say, this is how you make your grid. It's great. It always works with that. Sometimes it doesn't.
You kind of works around all these.
That's great.
Are we gonna do
Yeah.
I think we're gonna call that, this thing, if we have time, but this is, you see this one, Flexbox is not like super supported by everything. I'm sure they're dealing with like most of the cutting edge use parameters. You may saw.
That's interesting. So, let me explain what's happening. Okay. So, notice we've got these 3 things. And then what's happening is, since they're all floating, their cumulative width is greater than 100%. It's causing one percent.
Here. So, I'm gonna check with
Okay, so what do we know about
the
this is about earlier about
so,
Actually,
just so I know what we're trying to get to, yeah. Okay, so, let's,
Just using like how you apply this here.
So these are.
I was just wondering why it was so tight.
Yeah, I heard that.
This
This
is.
is.
So that's.
It's actually separated.
That's something that should.
Yeah, I mean, basically anywhere, anytime you're going to maybe use floats from like then you're probably gonna wanna have that little sound code. You can use, this is another option you can use, but this is actually better. So in reality, you don't really need this guy, you can just use this guy. So, why is exactly what it's so whenever you have a layout, you say I've got 3 columns. What you need to do is make sure that your 3 columns, your 3 boxes, whatever they are, size. Those are your 3 containers that you want to size appropriately. Make sure that they all share one common parent, in this case, your name, right? And then you want to, so that thing is effectively going to represent the row, right? And it's got 3 columns. So on the row, the container, that's where you're going to always apply this clear fits. And it's going to solve that weird collapsing issue.
Yes, you're floating around.
So this was just some default, so the border is just class, and so all that we do is we define borders to.
Did they say we do all the layouts or just one?
All of them.
All of them, okay.
As many as you can.
Okay.
So you can use them all. So now, what you do is that the voters all 5.
Yeah, you're not going to float your body because body is just all of the age content. You're gonna
So now all 5 of those
have
boxes
like for example some set width,
and then
right? That's going to go into class container, and it would usually be floated because again it's going to go to like one
Okay,
side.
so
You're going to do like
this is the stuff where you can max script change. Do you understand what this guy is? Yeah.
So I think the
This stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we call that inspection?
Oh yeah,
It's just like it's kind of just what is 33 plus 33? Yeah, just always put that on your container.
Watch it go straight.
It's exactly, so that's what you're saying.
Add like 0.333.
Add a couple threes.
Oh my gosh, bro.
All the floats.
So just like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sufficient. Right size to fill up the space.
Cool, yeah, but that's why it's gotta add up to that.
Yeah.
Decimals.
So I had, like this before, so I just gave it a size. And it looks like this.
Okay, yeah.
This, I wanted to fill up the space. And I tried to do 20%.
Yes.
And that was, it was like going over the next one.
Because the
So,
motor got all the way across, they did 50% of the.
see, it's like, oh.
So if you have.
Yeah.
Between
Actually, the easiest way to figure this out is right click on any one of those and inspect it. Well, it's the ways, and basically a pair of 100%. So we got 3 things.
You have a straight closing value tag on it.
Oh.
Always be
okay.
sure. Always be sure when you're deleting stuff.
So-
everything.
What you probably want to do is you got
Because it's tough to
floating
spot.
right, which is good. You got this guy floating, and that's right. Okay. So the white space that you're seeing between those that exists, you have white space between its buttons. So there's two ways to solve that. One, we both kind of are inelegant in our own way. One way would be literally just doing this, which obviously would be annoying, but it would work.
Oh, okay.
So that's one way. The other way would be when you float things, it actually collapses all that white space.
Okay.
So if you float all of these guys left, they're all gonna float within this nav container, and then that would solve it. So if you just have a float left on the button, it should solve it.
So why does that happen? Why does that happen?
I would just expect
I mean, it treats white space, it's sort of like when you have happy space days, you actually see a space in the browser.
Okay,
So had you also,
Yeah, well, let's before I can see
is it treats that as a white space. Now, the interesting thing is, the odd type is anyone spaces, it all treats it as one. But literally like any form of white space, you will just wait for that space for.
So, is it okay that I?
20 breaks?
Oh, yeah, I mean, in this case, the issue is like, are there like semantic enough last names?
Maybe, yeah, I mean, you can just call it articles.
It's okay.
Yeah, you're just working on targeting
Argo,
things.
here, it's Argo, just Argo.
Yes.
That's great.
Oh, your class names are.
Why would I?
As long as you're targeting what you want, it's layout's great.
Okay. Thank you.
So I don't need this.
Right, now, you don't want that, that's fine, because the header and the paragraph tag are both block elements, so they're gonna fall to a new line anyway. Now, if that was like a span and a strong tag, then you would actually see a bit of a white space between the two.
Okay.
Alright, so
three paragraphs.
I'm looking at this, and the one interesting thing I see is this main tag opens here,
Preset, but you can't use paragraphs to
may or may not be.
I'm like,
overflow?
I'm not sure what I see.
Okay.
So, was that intentional?
No, I'm adjusting what we.
Okay, so,
Oh.
so.
Yeah, okay, so if you're writing like a blog, for example,
Okay,
you have
so
multiple
probably
paragraphs, then I would just create
closing.
multiple paragraph tags. Yeah.
So basically, the main is our first row, 2 boxes, and then our section is our next row of 3 boxes. You see how that goes?
Like right there.
Yeah, exactly. So this is row 1, and this is row 2. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so first of all, let's go take a look at what it looks like now. Probably won't be all fixed, but it'll be a little better, maybe not. So let's figure out what that is. So how are we gonna go about doing that? Just do it in the browser. Use our tools.
Oh.
That's okay.
So you're good, I'm trying to get this space.
So, well, we can do it like that, but to get more precise, so we actually write that thing that we're trying to
I guess they're all
find, and then it's.
So
that's what we drill down and
notice.
find it.
There's nothing in here.
So there's just like an empty article hanging out inside of article, which is kind of weird, right?
Right.
So what I see when I see this kind of problem is generally like we use the open tag. We meant to use the close tag, and now Chrome's trying to guess at what we might see because the HTML is not valid anymore.
Right.
And it, clearly is not doing a very good job.
Creators.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's
So let's look at this HTML.
And that was because I was gonna put all these into them and.
Probably, you'll notice that the line that
Oh, here.
it's another open tag.
I think,
And the
like,
next tag is closed tag.
I mean, the tag is really the end of the exercise, so.
So, yeah, so now we're on this.
But if you go back to the PDF. So let's see.
Okay, better. And now we see something that looks familiar from what we
Are actually
Yeah, we're-
justified to the right.
Well,
Yeah.
one, the footer is behind, right?
Exactly, and the footer's behind because what's happened in this section.
It's actually releasing.
Yeah, it collapsed in on itself, right? And its children are kind of hanging outside of it. So we've got to fix that.
Oh.
Okay, so That's in there. So when we
Well, what's the thing that collapsed?
section,
Right.
so you need to define, I can't remember.
There are three ways you can actually fix
Oh, the
it.
clear,
Exactly.
the clear fix. So you
Exactly.
do the clear fix and, well, yeah, well, that's where you would do it then, right?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And remember, you can have multiple, well, no, we have everything in CSS that we already need. But remember, you can have multiple classes on single elements.
Right, well, we haven't even though I gave that a class, I haven't given the other class.
Okay, well then let's get rid of that, because we've already defined a class that works for this.
Okay, so give license.
Well, instead of other things, we need a different class that actually fixes the problem.
So before we, just try.
Or they need a width.
Yeah, with that won't help.
Now, if we did like have an articles class, and we were giving it like some styles, we could use that one as well, but just adding a space and adding the articles in that, in between those quotes as well. And now it has both of these classes, right?
Oh, so like,
Or about this one. It's real important.
Yeah, no, yeah,
say it wasn't clear.
Or
yeah, whatever, my class, exactly, it's fun, exactly. So now it has both of those classes, and we can have this, an articles rule and a stud.
But for floating, usually what you do is, it's like overflow hidden for the container div. And then,
Yay.
Yeah,
but like basically,
Well, when it comes to.
yes. How's it going?
here's the real issue is
Yes.
that area is a set border that's like jumping out as the things out at it. You're seeing that kind of like, so just one of those, just style gets, yeah, like,
Yeah, okay.
so ideally,
yeah,
right,
good
you're just
question,
gonna have the
right?
content
Okay,
is
so,
set, right, like there's not gonna
these
be
two
that
lineups,
border.
right?
So for the purposes of exercise, I would just like set your divs.
So,
So
this is something that-
yeah, just add a hyperbox.
exactly. I'm telling you.
Because I was thinking, I was like, that is definitely not, like, it seems easy on paper, but it's actually like, alright, so all this basically saying, but in CSS, you're basically saying, like, all these things are lined up, everyone's along that item there. So, it seems to be actually a JavaScript.
Awesome. It's probably, it's close as it's gonna get, you can get a little.
Just keep adding threes on the way through. Alright, cool, thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem.
Just like a fixed type, yeah.
Sorry, one last question. So with like the navigation, like when these were,
How to shift the over to the right. Let's just put them inside of something.
Sorry, yeah, so it's like what you're doing. So if you do control that, to control right.
so then when it's like that, my house is, in order for me to get like this, the vertical alignment.
Yeah, it's really just a border box, think about it this way.
So it'd be vertical alignment.
Where you can take space if you have like, you know that you're gonna have
Maybe that
even if you have padding inside that elevator, it's not gonna affect
Yeah.
50/50.
we talked.
And then that's what creates the space. Yeah, whereas content box is good.
Yeah, there are a number of strategies.
And
And all you have is
now,
that in there.
now it's
and
gonna
then
say
these sort of vertical
plus
centers,
the
and then you can
padding.
probably-
So,
You can tell like how tall is each one.
Well, you can use content box, but it just involves so much more to put this in.
So then the text. So that's what they, that's a typical way.
You can with, I say you can with content box.
You know, there are other ways, there is a vertical line.
Whereas
It
in
works
border box, you only have to add in margin.
Most of these are designed like.
Right, so think about this, right, think about the
But
way they're named,
probably the
content
easiest way
box
to
is
manage
content.
vertical alignment is using something.
Padding border margin,
It's
whereas
like a-
border box, is the borders, you have border
technology
padding,
related,
so
creative,
the margin.
Read some things about it.
Yeah. So the
It's
naming
probably
comes
so
out, that's
they
where
are
actually
actually
all
materials
those actually
stacked
like,
up.
routes
So
is
if you're
calculated.
interested in that.
yeah.
Rub,
Or sides that are inside of
then you miss the rules, which they won't work in IE. 10 years.
Oh, okay.
So it's very, it's very cutting edge, but it was designed with that problem in mind. So it makes it very easy.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I know we put the thing right and we used other things with that.
Yes.
So this is all you, so keep that like, or the header.
Yeah.
So if you're ever
So
trying to
this
line
whole
a few
thing,
things
all of
up,
it is like, okay.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
And then maybe you drop some boxes here.
Put them all inside the container.
And then within this
They
box,
otherwise
there's
float
float
over
left.
Oh, that sounds way too large. No. It's almost like I
And then just start thinking that within my little space, float them to the left, and that'll make them all line up like that.
Cool.
Okay, if I could get your attention up here for a second. I know you're hard at work, and that's great. So I encourage you, whatever you haven't finished yet tonight, to continue working on this like tomorrow and maybe before class on Wednesday, so that if you do run into any trouble, you can maybe talk to Eric before class or myself. I usually am here early as well. We can sort of debrief and figure out if you ran into any issues that you weren't able to solve. But while we have a few minutes left, I did want to talk about one thing, and that's the final project, because we're rapidly approaching the first milestone. Remember, that's March 9th, which is actually a week from Wednesday. Okay, so this is coming up pretty quickly. And what we want by that time is sort of not a super formal, but we want some sort of project proposal, like a paragraph describing what your project is, as well as something we call wireframes. And people had questions about this, so I'm going to dive into that for a second. Okay, so here's a definition I found on the internet. Wireframes are an image or set of image which display functional elements of a website page, typically used for planning and site structure and functionality. Long-winded. Basically, it's like a sketch of what your thing will look like. Okay, and here's some examples. Like here's a pretty low fidelity sketch of what some web page might look like. Maybe they use when I do my little things for slides, I use just like Google Slides, and I just draw boxes and stuff, and that's perfectly sufficient. Or PowerPoint or something like that, if that's what you choose to use. There is software, for wireframing. Most of that, you pay for, and there might be some open source or free versions of those things. If you want to do that, cool, but it's certainly not a requirement for this class. Also, this is totally cool too. Like a hand-drawn little sketch of, what your site might look like. I saw a lot of people sketching tonight, trying to draw the boxes and the layouts. That type of thing is perfectly fine as well. Basically, what we want to be able to do is between now and March 9th, at some point, we want to be able to talk about your project and your idea for a project. Maybe if you're having trouble getting one, we can think through some inspiration. Or if you have something that you think is really ambitious or maybe not ambitious enough, we can kind of counsel you on, what is a realistic project for this class. Okay. And so I'm going to make available, hopefully sometime tomorrow, I'll post a set of appointment times should you choose to meet with me in person, or one of the TAs during office hours. We can talk about not only what you have planned and some of expectation setting for your final project. We also maybe talk a little bit about what you have, what your hopes are for this course, and is it are you learning the things you'd hope you learn? What things do you hope to do with the information that you learn in this course? And that can help me just going forward to be a little bit more tailored to your specific needs. Okay, so I'll make those available hopefully tomorrow, and they'll be 15-minute slots before class or during my office hours or something like that. And they could be via a Google Hangout. You don't have to come here if you don't want to. But it's just a helpful way for me to sort of get an idea of what everybody has in mind for their final projects. Any questions about the final projects? Okay, cool. So remember that first milestone is March 9th. It's a week from Wednesday. Okay, cool. All right. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes left. Okay, in that case, please do fill out the exit ticket. He's on it. Thanks, man. It's in the general channel.
Nice.
If you want to just fill that out, let us know what you thought of today. And,
Class 6.
Today's class 6. Thank you. And again, please do, try to finish that layout challenge between now and Wednesday. So that if you do run up against anything or have any questions, you can always reach out to us on Slack. I'm usually on Slack most of the day for work anyway, so I'm pretty responsive there. Yeah. Cool. Thanks. All right, and I'm gonna hang out for a little bit. If you want to continue plugging away for a few minutes or so, and have any questions, last questions, it's totally cool.
So I really ordered this whole thing out. That whole thing out is the real thing.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
I'll do the ticket, I text it later.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Have a good night.
Right? So, but the point being is that you've got three things that you do side by side, right? So what you should always try to do is, so obviously right away we're saying all three of these need to be covered left. Whenever you create something that has a row, that has a it, always put some sort of retaining element around it. I think you can use a main element, right? Always add a index class to that. That's the only way you have to know, right? So so in the case of like the thing from the header, you had the logo, and then you had
It was looking good, and the different things.
it's just on.
Okay, so my first instinct whenever something goes wrong is not to go back to my code. It's to
Yeah, you actually could. I mean,
Because, like,
this
that's
is
how
really
you
because there was
sort of
nothing.
poke around it, see what's
But yeah, I mean, it would have been just as good to. So I think this was
Do you not know use
you do
Edge? No, I don't use Edge ever, but I can.
Oh, it's a default.
I tried going into the
Yeah.
build.
Just always put it on the thing that represents the
Change
logo.
the settings.
And yeah, you can
We do
nest
that
them,
work.
close inside of this thing.
I looked it up and I did put a thing at the sound line, so I was like, what do you do?
Yeah, the erasing doesn't, as well as
Thanks.
using.
Yeah, sure. So one way you could do this is just copy the URL.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's flip it over here.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Do you like it? Is this sort of like external? This is my preferred.
Yeah.
Just 'cause it's
I was
easier.
just seeing if I could.
Yeah,
I was thinking like at home, if I had like two monitors,
Oh, absolutely.
I could do like fit the window there and have that.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
So I just wanted to see if I could.
yeah. So first thing I would do is just use that upper left-hand corner. And so this is for the offending element, right? So let's click on that. Okay. Now, what do you do with this? This width property is.
Cross out.
So why is that? Well, if you hover over that, over there, it says invalid property value. So what part of that is the value?
That.
Okay?
Oh, is it the space?
Yeah. So that's enough. Yeah. Sadly, it's that simple. And I've said
Yeah, it is. I probably just bumped it as I'm doing so.
so. One of the skills that you'll gain from doing a lot of this type of work is you'll look at each character very closely and question yourself all the time. Yeah, thanks. Have a good night. Because it often is. It's pretty often just like a small little thing. It's probably
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, no.